What's up guys, it's OnsCG here, welcome back. Today I want to do something different. There is one card that is coming to the TCG really soon that is very hyped. This card is Crossout Designator. I understand why people are hyping this card, but to be honest I think the card is super overrated and it's not as good as people give it credit for. So in this video I'm going to share with you some thoughts on why I think this card does not deserve all the hype it gets just because it's a card that's similar to Called by the Grave. So before we begin, if you enjoy this video, give it a thumbs up, comment down below your thoughts if you think the card is actually better than I say it is, or if you agree with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the video. So to start things off, there is one aspect about this card that is not necessarily a negative, but for TCG standards I think it actually is a negative. It affects deck building. So in the OCG, even before this card came out, we were seeing decks with like one copy of Veiler, one copy of Imperm, one copy of Ghost Ogre. It's something that they've used to do, and they didn't really mind doing it even after Crossout Designator was out, because it's something you have to do if you want to play this card in the main deck, especially because you need to be able to cover a variety of hand traps in order to make sure that this card is not dead, so you can have a lot of chances of it being live when your opponent uses the same card. But this is something that I do not see TCG players ever doing, because we like our 3-offs, man, we like consistently, so it's something that I do not see any of us doing. So even if we try to do it, we would probably think that it's completely horrible because it affects consistency. When we want to play a hand trap, we want to play 3 copies of it. We would rather play 3 copies of Ash than playing 2 copies of Ash and 1 copy of Ogre, just in case we get hit by an Ogre so we can stop that Ogre, or maybe a DD Crow or Skullmeister. And a lot of decks do not really have the option of playing too many hand traps because they need a lot of cards in order to be able to function, unless it's a super tier 1 deck. That's something that doesn't require a lot of cards in order to work, but still there are not a lot of decks that can do that, so you have to make a choice on whether you want to make sure that this card is live more often or have it at the risk of being dead while keeping your deck more consistent. So this is why I think it's something for the TCG is going to be a little bit weird, but we want to see how this card actually affects deck building and if people are willing to adapt in order to make this card more viable. Now, I did mention the OnsCG, and yes, the OnsCG is playing this card in pretty much anything. And this is the bait for the TCG, and we're just made believe that this card is insane and it's just as good as Called by the Grave. But this is a huge mistake because this card, there's only one reason this card is so good in the OCG, and this card is Max C. Max C is basically in every deck in the OCG. If you're not playing Max C in the OCG, in any deck list, you're basically trolling. So they have a card in the deck that will always be able to be countered by Crossout Designator. In a TCG, there is not a certain hand trap that is being played in every single deck. I mean, if you're playing a combo deck, I understand why you want to use this card. Maybe you're afraid of Nibiru. That's perfectly fine. You want to counter Nibiru with something like that, and Nibiru is something that you could not have countered aside from just playing around it, but you could not negate it. So now you have something to counter Nibiru, but not a lot of people play Nibiru, at least not in the main deck, and in this format Nibiru is not really good of a card. People have opted to play stuff that cut cards from the grave, so cards like DD Crow, Skullmeister, and Ghost Bill have become more relevant. So the thing is that you can adapt to a format, but is this card really worth playing in the main deck? Because it could be really dead sometimes. Unless you're playing a mirror match, which, yes, it would always be live because you would always have the same amount of cards and you will always use the most key cards for that specific archetype. But if you're not playing a mirror, then it could be completely dead if you're maining it. Because let's say that you wanted to play a combo deck and you're playing 1 copy of Nibiru in your deck, maybe like 1 copy of Dark Ruler no more to stop that as well, and you would just want to make sure that your combo can be completely safe. Yes, that's true. And you open your combo with your Crossout Designator and then your combo is fine, but you're playing something that could be completely dead because you're playing 1 copy of Nibiru, 1 copy of Dark Ruler no more, that these cards are not that great anymore, at least not in the main deck, because of stuff like Eldritch, and you're playing Crossout Designator, and if your opponent does not play the cards you want to negate and you see the copies of Crossout Designator, then it's a card that you won't be able to activate. So unless your deck is super consistent, then this might affect your combo. So it offers protection at the cost of consistency, which is something that only combo players would actually play, because if you're playing something like Eldritch or any trap deck, you don't really need something like that because there's not one hand trap that can completely interrupt your combo unless you have bricked, but that doesn't have anything to do with Crossout Designator. On top of that, it actually helps you with breaking if you play something like that. So this is why Crossout Designator in some situations is completely dead, in other situations it's very situational, so you have to be very careful on whether you want to actually main this card, and even if you side it, you have to play a lot of 1-offs or maybe 2-offs just to make sure that your opponent actually has the same amount of cards. For example, when they're playing hand traps and they play like 4 different hand traps, and you need to play all those hand traps as well because your combo can be interrupted by any of these, and you cannot actually afford to play all 4 of them at 3-offs, so you have to make sure that you have all 4 of them, maybe 1-off or 2-off, just to be able to negate them. Now, they compare this card to Call by the Grave a lot. Yeah, I can see why, but the problem is that Call by the Grave is so much more generic. When you play Call by the Grave, let's take for example today's format, stuff like Eldritch get destroyed by Call by the Grave. Just banish their Eldritch from the grave, or when you're playing against Dinos, you banish the Misk, or when you're playing against Drytrons, you can banish Benten, you can banish the Drytrons from the grave, so when they try to recover. And this is why I think it's a bit unfair to compare Crossout Designator with Call by the Grave, because even if your opponent did not play any hand traps in their deck, Call by the Grave still had a lot of uses in order to be able to use against a lot of archetypes. It was hardly ever dead. Crossout Designator does not have that unless you're playing a mirror like I mentioned earlier, but if your opponent doesn't play any hand traps, then Crossout Designator is basically a dead card. And if you're playing 3 copies of it, yes, you're going to see it, so yeah, you have something that we'll never be able to use in that matchup. This is why Call by the Grave, it's not only because Call by the Grave went to 1 that actually makes people want to buy Crossout Designator, and because it had to go to 1. It's not because it was just a budget version of a Crossout Designator, it's because it was a much better card than Crossout Designator. So this is why Konami made sure that they put it to 1 in order to ensure that the card is going to get sold once it comes out, because let's be real, the card is probably going to be a secret rare, which is the saddest part about it. Even if it's not the best card, people don't really know that yet because they just wait until pros and we start seeing the card in tournaments, but they're going to spend hundreds of dollars for this card on release without even thinking whether the card is actually good or not. It's going to have a price very similar to Droplet and Triple Tactics Talent because it's another set that's going to have 2 generic spells, this being Crossout Designator and the new pot that banishes 6 and helps you excavate for a card. So yeah, it's a card that before you buy it, just think a little bit about it, whether you actually need it. I think that it's something that combo players actually need, not a lot of control decks. You don't really need that. Even if you play Eldritch and you stop an Ash, that's really not worth the risk, because if your deck gets hit by an Ash and it loses, then you're probably not playing something that can actually win very consistently. So this is why I think that in situations like this, then you need to make your deck more consistent, rather than playing a card that not only could be dead, but also you spend a lot of money for it. And in the OCG, Maxi is what makes this card broken, and we take whatever we see in the OCG without even thinking why they do it in the OCG, and this is why you are going to get baited by a card like this, of course, because you see it in every single deck, but Maxi is there. They can negate Maxi in every single matchup, everyone plays it, so and if your deck, especially if your deck loses to Maxi, if you're playing Eldritch, you don't really care, you can just special summon 1 and Maxi will be basically an upstart. But if you're playing something like a Virtual World which special summons a lot from the hand, or maybe like a Drytron, same thing, then you need to be able to negate that. But here we don't have Maxi. The high impact hand trap is Nibiru, but it's not that much of high impact right now because not a lot of decks play a lot of summons, and even in Virtual World they would much rather play around Nibiru than try to negate Nibiru, because they can just summon 1 Calamities, use its effect to debate Nibiru, your opponent is forced to use Nibiru there, and then they summon the second Calamities, and that's basically the game. So with this card, it's going to come out really soon. It's going to be a very controversial card. I think a lot of people are going to love it, a lot of people are going to hate it. I think it's I'm probably towards the hate aspect, just because the card is hyped for no reason. People hype something without even thinking about it. They see it in the OCG, they're like, yes, this card's broken, we have to get it, we have to spend like $300 for the playset, and we're going to have it just in case. But before you do that, just make sure that you actually need the card for the deck you're playing, because it can be a very bad investment depending on what type of player you are and depending on what type of deck you're playing. So yep, guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, comment down below if you think that the card is actually overrated, or if you have any points on why you think the card is really good. We can discuss it down below and see exactly if the card is actually worth it and how much the card actually should be worth, because yep, a card like Droplet can be $100, but I don't think this card can actually be, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you guys have points that can prove me wrong. So yep, comment down below and see what we can get out of it. So yep, that's the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content. We'll see you next time.